People have often described to me this feeling that they have upon seeing freshly fallen snow, where they have this deep urge to run out and trample all over it, in some way to disturb the perfect, pristine nature of it. But I personally have never experienced this. Well, I suppose you could call it a form of the imp of the perverse that other people have described to me. In fact, my feelings are often quite the opposite. In the few times that I've beheld a vast plain of freshly fallen, untouched snow in front of me, perhaps if I happened to have been lucky enough to be going on a country walk on the morning of heavy snowfall, I would intentionally try not to disturb the snow in any way I could, walk on the path where the snow had not fallen, or try and walk myself around the edges of a field rather than trample my footsteps right across it. And that's not because I have any personal aversion to snow. In fact, one of my most favourite feelings and one of my most favourite sensations, sounds in life is crunching over softly fallen snow. You can hear that crunching, compacting noise across steady footsteps along fallen snow. As much as I enjoy that, and certainly do treat myself to it occasionally in a snowy place, there is something too beautiful about the way snow falls over a landscape. And not just across wide fields, but the way it layers itself over the top of anything, over the branches of trees, and the way that sometimes it will almost cup itself on top of a leaf that is drooping downwards, heavy with the weight of this powdery snow, though it doesn't fall off in a way that seems to defy explanation. The way it lands softly on top of hand railings, for example, all in a long, neat line. I think that's truly beautiful in a way that I can't really put my finger on. It could be something to do with the way it almost holds a mirror to the things in the environment. It's like the snow falls down as a creature and cuddles up to all of the things that it finds as it lands on the ground, and in some way makes them cozier. It makes them feel less imposing in a way. It can take any landscape and, with this scattering of chilly white powder, will make everything feel a bit more approachable. Does that make sense? I'm finding it very difficult to describe the feeling, that I'm having when I reminisce. Walking along through fields and through my neighborhood on a snowy day. Hello, by the way. My name's Andrew, and today I'm talking about snow. And the reason I've decided to discuss snow is because it happens to be a particularly warm day where I am. And if you find yourself at the moment in a bit of a warm environment, I'm hoping that this discussion of the chilly white powder, as I've said before, will help you cool down, at least in spirit. I think sometimes it helps. And even now, just imagining a snowy landscape is starting to help me feel a little cooler in general. You know, one very particular memory springs to mind when I think about fresh fallen snow. It happened a few years ago now, during November, and the snow had fallen heavy. And I wasn't at home at this time. I was a few hours north of where I live, visiting my partner's family. And they're all quite athletic people, as am I, to some degree, although I wouldn't say quite as much. And they invited me, some of them at least, to go on a morning jog. And I was quite happy to come along on this little run. Not just because I felt that morning, particularly as I remember that I needed to have a bit of a stretch to get my body moving, but because I knew that the snow had freshly fallen, and the place where my partner's family live is very beautiful. The surrounding countryside is one of my favorites. And to take a little snowy jog through some of that countryside and forest, I thought would be a wonderful opportunity. And so we did. And I remember not being quite as prepared as I should have been. I think I had a long sleeve top on, but wearing shorts in that sort of weather, even when you are moving your body quite a lot, will still make you quite chilly. But although it was, as I remember, some 20 kilometers through forest and field and village, it was one of the best jogs I've ever been on. Very few jogs of the many I've taken in my life stick out in my memory, usually because I'm often retracing the same places I've been before, so they can blur into one, but occasionally they can be filled with magic. I think that's my favorite thing about jogging. Not the physical exertion of it exactly, but the opportunity to explore, to see things and go to places that make you feel inspired, and to take paths you've never taken before. And I remember specifically running through part of the woodland near their home, and it was just like I described before. The way the snow had fallen, particularly onto these holly leaves, and had cupped the snow so as to form little oval shaped piles, and even how the snow had piled just on top of the red berries of this holly. Very, very small, tiny pile, and in the snow, how, for some reason, the holly and the redness of the berries really shone. It looked unreal in some ways. I remember as I ran past it, I had to stop to admire it, to the point where those I was running with thought something had happened, that I'd maybe tripped or needed to tie my shoe or something. But sometimes something in nature takes you so by surprise that you can't simply walk past it. You do have to sit and appreciate it. I do remember feeling awfully chilly and tired after that run though. It was, well, it must have been -2, -3 outside. That's Celsius. In the UK, I'm not entirely sure what that would be in Fahrenheit. I've never really understood the comparison. I feel like that would be something like -30 in Fahrenheit. But I honestly have no real idea of the difference in scale. But it was certainly cold outside, and my legs were burning red with the cold. So was my face, as I'm sure you must have experienced once or twice before in your life when you've been out in the cold for some time and you have that burning redness on your skin from the cold air outside. On a day like today, I do miss that sort of feeling. It's funny how the longer you think about being in the snow, the more you recollect about what that sort of environment really feels like. Like until I started talking just now, I think I'd forgotten what snow sounds like. And I don't really mean what it sounds like as it falls, or the sound of a snowball hitting against a car window, or the sound of sleds sliding down the hill, as there are many sounds, beautiful sounds associated with the snow. But more in that way that it makes everything sound a lot closer. I don't know if you've ever noticed this when you're out in the snow, but if you find yourself lucky enough to have a snowy day sometime soon, which I'm guessing you may need to wait a little while for, depending on when you're listening to this. But you may notice, as you're talking, as you're walking, that the snow, I suppose if I was to try and give some kind of technical explanation, the snow somehow absorbs the wavelengths of the sound. It acts as some kind of sound dampener, perhaps. And those sort of echoes and reverberations that one would get on a normal day disappear. And as such, there is this beautiful silence to a snowy day. It gives it even more of a momentous and sacred feeling, like all the world is especially quiet when the snow has arrived. In that sense too, you can hear the little details of nature around you so much more. The flitting of a bird from a tree, the snapping of a twig, and especially so the whistling of the wind. I love that aspect of a snowy day. Of course, it's not always enjoyable, especially if you spend too long in the snow. Being too cold is not one of my favorite experiences in life, but at least it gives you ample opportunities to get cozy. In fact, one of the best things about winter and its coldness is the ways in which we find to get away from it. Light the fire, sit under some warm blankets, have a nice warm cup of tea or hot chocolate, or my personal favourite, having a nice warm bath. I never enjoy baths so much as when I am particularly cold beforehand. What an amazing feeling. You know, sometimes I have imagined to myself living in one of these countries where it seems to snow perpetually. I think in some areas of Russia, Siberia, it can get to preposterously low temperatures, and you see sometimes, perhaps you may or may not have seen television programs or videos online of people that live in these places and the daily rituals of putting on layers of clothing and preparing themselves to go outside for these freezing temperatures. I don't know if I could live in a place like that. Though I suppose it's only because it's quite different to where I live. You may in fact live in a place like that and be saying to yourself and to me, oh, it's not so bad. It's something you get used to. That's certainly what I say to people from other countries when they talk to me about the rain. That's certainly something we get used to. Like anything, really. Any sort of weather. If it's something you live with, have lived with, it's not so bad. I think that's why I especially appreciate British weather. Because although there is a stereotype that it's simply raining all the time, and it does rain quite a lot, don't get me wrong, but I feel like we experience the breadth that weather can offer without ever getting too far into the extremes. And if you're one who is apt to appreciate all kinds of weather, then it's the perfect environment. It gives you a great sense of changing and rhythm in the year. It can really help you find your place and time within your memory, if you can remember what it was like outside. My uncle, every time it snows, loves to tell a story from when I was young to myself and my brother. You see, he lived across the road from me in the house that I grew up in. And we grew up on a street that was at the bottom of a hill in a cul-de-sac. And for some reason, one snowy day in the winter, when we were 6 or 7 years old, maybe a little older, my uncle had a couple of huge sleds ready for us to enjoy. And the snow was so thick that we needn't worry too much about any cars or traffic coming by, because people were not driving on that day. And so this long slope of a road for that day was our sledding slope. I do remember it quite vividly, though I think it was wasted on me at the time. Since that age, I have come to enjoy being a little more adventurous, doing slightly more adventurous activities, but I think I only slid down that hill no more than twice before the fear of the lack of control overcame me. Though I got just as much enjoyment out of watching my brother and cousins go down the hill. There's this place nearby where I live. It's a music venue, really, and other events go on there. But the unique feature of it is that it's, if you can imagine in your mind, sort of like an amphitheatre, an old-fashioned amphitheatre made of grass entirely. So you have a stage at the bottom, and then these huge slopes of grass that rise up around the edges so that people may sit on the grass and look down this sort of artificial hill at the performances that are going on. And as you can imagine, on a snowy day, this place is filled with people. It almost becomes the perfect ski slope. And I'm not sure, whether they actually open it up to the public, or whether it is that people find their way in there. Either way, you can't blame anyone for wanting to take their sled and cascade down the snowy mountains there. I've never been myself, and I live far away now, so I'm not sure that I'd have the opportunity to again. But I saw pictures, and it did look like a lot of fun. The place where I live as well, we have an artificial indoor ski slope filled with snow. Artificially created snow, of course, but certainly feels real, tastes real. And when you go in there, it's so cold, which I suppose makes sense. Otherwise, well, the snow would melt, wouldn't it? But it's a place where people practice skiing and snowboarding, which I've never actually done myself. But I have been tobogganing in there before. And the first time I went, I was so underprepared. I don't know what made me think that it wasn't going to be that cold. I suppose the whole idea of it being indoors had me subconsciously believe that it would be of an indoor temperature, but no, it was like a giant freezer in there. And once again, I was turning up unprepared in shorts, without gloves, without a hat. And I think I was tobogganing for about 10 minutes before I had to give up the rest of my half-an-hour session. I wasn't all that good at tobogganing either, which is why I'm able to tell you that the snow tasted real. There's something really wonderfully joyful about what snow brings out in people. I think that's part of the reason why it feels magic, is because it's often associated with community and togetherness. It's kind of like those times when the power goes out on your street and everybody comes outside to talk about this big thing that has happened. And it's funny how just something seemingly so simple can do that. Of course, a lot of my memories as a child of snow are associated with being snowed in and school being cancelled, which, of course, makes memories of snowy days very exciting. And in some ways it's a shame that we need something like that to get everybody out of their houses and on the street and talking to each other. It's a shame that we don't just... that we need an excuse to do those things. But maybe they wouldn't be half as special if we didn't wait until the special moments. For those of you who have joined me here a few times before, it might not surprise you to hear that one of my most favourite aspects of snow is the snowflake. As they say, no two snowflakes are alike, which is fascinating in its implication when you think about it. Because the reason that no two snowflakes are alike is because the number of ways, the number of possible patterns that could be created is unfathomably large. So large that probabilistically, the chances of two snowflakes being the same is incredibly unlikely. Though you do have to think, without checking every single one, surely at least once there have been a couple that were at least fairly similar. In my heart, I like to believe that's probably the case. You know, if you can imagine a snowflake in your mind, you may have seen a picture of one before. Of course, they have to use very special imaging technology to take a picture of a snowflake so close up. It looks so beautiful and icy and crystalline. And you can probably quite clearly picture that hexagonal shape that they tend to have. Those fractal branches that spread from its center, creating that beautiful geometric pattern. I hadn't really realized this before. I found out recently that, well, the way that snowflakes are produced is initially similar to the way rain occurs, in that within the clouds in the sky, little pieces of dust, tiny specks of debris float around, and water molecules attach themselves to this speck to form the rain droplet. But then, when it is particularly cold, the droplet itself freezes. And then, around that, would accumulate more water molecules. And then, interestingly enough, the very base form, the very smallest kernel of a snowflake, starts as a simple hexagonal prism. And you may be thinking, how on earth does it form a perfect six-sided hexagonal prism? But with some thought, you'll realize, and it's after being told, it seems so obvious to me, is that the atomic structure of these water molecules forming together forms a hexagonal shape. And as such, as it grows and more molecules accumulate on top, it just grows outwards from that base molecular structure. And in that way, looking at a snowflake, snowflakes which are, of course, already so very small, we are in a way looking at the projection, the artistic shadow, almost, of the things so much smaller that make it up. And those fractal branches that come away from the center well, they're created as the snowflake hangs and forms and is subject to different conditions, different subtle changes in temperature or humidity, which can cause the water molecules to accumulate in different ways. But each branch initially starts from the very tiny imperfections in that first initial kernel. And I think that is why it is possible to have so many different kinds of snowflake. But this idea that looking on a snowflake is to look really even deeper down into the very, very tiny molecules, atoms, fundamental matter that makes up the world, makes snowflakes even more special. And then the idea of imagining these tiny, intricate, detailed, geometric crystal patterns of fractal complexity. And that when you look out across that sea of fresh fallen snow on the country field, that is made up of millions, maybe billions of these tiny detailed structures. It makes the world seem impossible. And so, tell me, knowing that, how could I possibly want to run and trample all over it? As much as the sound of crunching snow is satisfying to the ear and the soul, I would rather stand at the edge, by the hedge, and feel the gentle breeze and the cold.
you. you.